Good evening, everyone. I am going to probably stop my video at some point during the presentation tonight because every once in a while I find it distracts me just a little bit when I'm talking and looking at myself at the same time. My magical name is Benin the Pagan, and it means woman of earth in Cornish. I am an eclectic pagan, and I practice earth-based and elemental and ancestral crafts and work with deities from Celtic and the Norse traditions. I'm also a geographer by trade, so I work a lot with the earth in all of my many trades and aspects. So tonight we're going to talk about working with cold deities in hot climates. Many of us here are work with systems and traditions and pantheons that come to us from temperate climates and from colder climates. But as a result of our very long migrations, and some of us maybe even are from the colder climates than where we live today, most of us in the Grove are living in warmer climates across the southern part of the US, from Florida all the way across to California. So I got really interested in how can we celebrate our ancestral traditions that arose in the context of really different environments from where we happen to live in today, and how can we still honor those spaces and places where we actually live. So tonight we'll talk about ways that we can adapt our ancient practices and crafts and rituals and cultivate our relationships with the wintry deities. It just so happens that this week we're having our first really big winter storm of the season in the mountains and getting some snow here locally. So what is in bulk in the beginning of spring for some people is kind of the beginning of winter for us here in Southern California. My goal is to not really necessarily introduce anything new, but to make space for us to be intentional about our practices and thoughtful about how we practice and how we might balance the ancient workings with the new environments where we live today. So to set the stage, I first want to think about some cold times and cold places. Perhaps we should really be thinking about the cold as a time as being somewhat relative. Many of us may be thinking, when we think of cold places, like the wintry image here on the top left of the slide. But the cold times in your area maybe mean something really different. What's the low temperature in your area? Maybe it's not necessarily cold, but maybe a little bit cooler. Maybe it's the season when the iguanas start to fall from the trees. Maybe it's the winter months when the oranges become ripe. Many of us may think of the cold times as a time of dormancy and rest, but I live in a Mediterranean climate where summers is the dormant season. So here the cold months are really our growing season. In Alaska, the cold months are really kind of the times of work because the ice makes it easier to travel from place to place. And in tropical climates, sometimes that cold season is really not really any colder, but it's a dry season. Maybe it's at night when the hot day becomes a little bit more tolerable. Maybe the cold is associated with darkness. And in the subtropical climates, especially as we get closer and closer to the equator, where the length of day doesn't change so much, maybe there's still a part of that year that's a little bit darker. So we know that without darkness, there is no light. And without cold, there's no warmth. And without rest, there's no vitality. And without death, there's no life. So it becomes really important for us to recognize and celebrate the cold times, wherever that might look like, where you happen to live. And just this in the same kind of way, many of the deities that we work with are coming from cultures and places that are colder than where we live today. Maybe they're from the higher latitudes closer to the poles, but even in our warmer regions, We do have cooler places. We have high altitude here in Southern California. I have access to the mountains within an hour or two away from me, for example. And altitude works a lot like latitude works. As you go up, the temperature drops. We also have dark, shady places and windy places and subterranean caves or basements that are cooler places. And so for the modern pagan, we also have artificial cooling, like air conditioners and refrigerators and freezers. So the cold deities might be those that come from the colder climates, but they might also be those that inhibit the cooler parts of the regions where we live or are associated with cooler conditions like snow and winter storms. So would you be surprised to know that our friends in the indigenous to warmer climates also have deities that are associated with winter and cold and snow and wind? We can find cold deities in Hawaiian, Incan, Aztec, Yoruba, and Maori traditions, for example. So we're going to chat about a few of the colder deities that we might be working with that have origins in colder places. And I'm going to focus on three goddesses from European traditions. One of the common threads that I've noticed with these deities is that they are all very old. They maybe even have origins that are older than the way we conceive of them today. So I'm going to especially focus on my own workings with Skadi and a little bit less and a little bit less for the two other deities that we're going to look at. So Skadi is a master skier and a hunter, and she's often pictured with skis and a bow and arrow and with her wolves. When her father was killed by Loki, she marched into Asgard in full battle dress and demanded retribution. She was offered compensation in the form of a husband, and she had to choose her husband by looking at his feet. Well, she was in love with Balder, so she thought Balder was going to have the most beautiful feet. And so she picked the most beautiful feet she saw. And as it turned out, it was Njord. And Njord is a god that's associated with the sea, with the wind, with summer, and with fulfillment. Their marriage was very unhappy. She was from the mountains and she was very used to hearing wolves cry, but in the near the coast and in the sea, that was the place where the seagulls cried, and that sound just absolutely, she did not like it. She couldn't bear it. So Skadi and Njord agreed to spend 9 nights in her cold mountain home and 3 nights at sea. This likely explains the landscape in the annual seasons found in Norway and Scandinavia, especially in Norway, where you really go from ocean to mountain very quickly, where you have 9 months of cold and 3 months of warm. The pair eventually separated and she retreated alone back to her mountain home. The Heimskringla tells us that she married Odin and that they had many children together, and perhaps that these are the people that first populated the mountains. In exchange for revenge, she was also promised that the gods would make her laugh, and so Loki tied one end of a rope to a goat and the other end to his testicles, and every time the goat jumped, Loki would squeak and squeal and jump, and it finally drew out her laugh. Odin then threw her father's eye up into the sky and it became the stars, and that really pleased Skadi. Other stories tell of her really complicated relationship with Loki and with the Aesir. She foretold Loki's torture, and when it came to be, she held a snake over his head and it was dripping venom into a bowl. And Loki's wife Sigyn was holding the bowl. And when the bowl was full, Sigyn went to empty it, and the venom fell upon his face, causing him to writhe in pain so much that it caused a tremendous earthquake. Being from California, I especially appreciate the inclusion of earthquakes in some of our winter stories. Some other versions of the story say that Loki's blood is what dripped out of the bowl and that it dripped on Scotty and it made her pregnant. So it was left to Scotty to avenge her father's death, and that chore normally would have gone to the closest male relative. So that might be a clue that she no longer had any male relatives, that she had been taking on the job of the head of the household in the family structure that she had. Or at least that she didn't have any male relatives, or that they were absent. It could also be that she was the strongest of her kin. And there are some scholars that believe that maybe Scotty was actually originally in the Proto-European tradition, maybe was a male figure, and over time took on more and more feminine attributes. So either way, we know that Scotty doesn't really hold on to conventional gender norms, and she isn't afraid to embrace both her feminine and her masculine self. Her story tells us of her powers. She's really fierce and she's a defender of justice, and that's really what she was seeking from the Aesir. She is very logical. She doesn't act out of haste. She tempers her anger. She's not really cold-hearted, but she is very efficient in her movements, and she is able to set aside her discomfort and emotions to be able to achieve a goal. And that goal is often tied to her very deep caring for others, and especially for her family. She's brave, but that doesn't mean that she's unafraid. She's brave in the way that you continue with the fear. One of my favorite snowboarders is actually a child, and the parents have taught her, when she says she's scared, she says, well, what do we do when we're scared? And she says, we do it anyway, right? We just do it scared. And so that's kind of her, Scotty's representation of bravery. She's really independent. She likes a lot of solitude, but she has really deep ties to who she considers her family. She lives simply, but she's also very complicated. And just like Winter, she represents darkness, but also the snowy white. So she's a contradiction. She has a lot to teach us, even if we aren't in or near her Scandinavian mountains. She reminds me that my anger can be a gift when it's wielded correctly. It drives my passions to work for justice, and especially my work for social and environmental justice. She teaches me how to harness the anger so that I can wield it as a tool or as a weapon, rather than allowing it to consume me and for me to act with a lot of chaos. She kind of helps to temper the Tasmanian devil in me. She guides the warrior woman spirit in me and can help me put it to good use. She reminds me that we need to take time to ourselves and to spend time in nature or to cool off, to remain in nice balance. She reminds me that I'm a part of a much larger whole, and that my strength comes from my chosen family. She reminds me to have a sense of humor and to set aside shallowness. She reminds me that we need to stay true to ourselves, and when we don't stay true to ourselves, that we make bad decisions, and that we really only make good decisions when we're honest. She reminds me that we have to be stewards of nature and that our existence depends on it. She didn't have a whole lot of use for the gold that was first offered to her by the Aesir. She's very pragmatic, and she wants true justice and useful goods. She's very pragmatic in that kind of way. She's very utilitarian. She's oftentimes associated with journeys of life and with the hunt and for what sustains us. And this can be in the physical sense that she's a hunter, but it can also be in the metaphysical sense in our souls. She was an expert skier and a bow hunter, so we'll oftentimes see her depicted with these as symbols. And she likes ale and mead and vodka and warm beverages. And even though it doesn't come from where she comes from, many people that work with Scotty attest that she likes coffee. And I like coffee too. She likes warm spices and roasted meat and root vegetables and hearty bread, those meals that we associate with winter. And she likes juniper, pine, fir, cedar, wintergreen, peppermint, spearmint, red berries, and fir. So there's many ways that we can work with and honor Scotty, and many of these ways we can do whether we're in the areas that she comes from or in places that she doesn't come from. Because her story is one of blood price, she really appreciates blood offerings. Especially blood offerings made in the first snow. So the blood ritual is symbolic to her in many ways. The gods offered her a blood price in exchange for her father's death. Blood honors the rights of hunting and righteous battle, and it represents those bonds of oath and family. So I live where I can go be in the mountain snow in an hour or two. And so every year we go through this little bit of a pattern that we've seen this year where there's a couple of snows that are too high, they melt too fast. I never really quite get to them. But when we get a snow like we're getting right now in the mountains, it's coming down to a pretty low elevation. It's going to snow repeatedly. It's going to be there for a long time. So every year, the first snow that I can get to, right? I get to go and connect with her, and I'll dedicate myself to her by leaving a very small drop of my blood and the rune. I draw the rune Isa in the snow and leave peppercorns or evergreens. I also will take some of the snow and rub it on my face to cleanse myself. And then I rub it on a tattoo that I have of her on my leg. On my leg, I have a Norse tattoo of Skadi and Njord and a couple of the other Norse deities that I follow. And Skadi on my leg is on the shin so that she guides my first steps. And so I ask her first, and I'll oftentimes harvest some fir and cedar, and that will be my last forage for the season so that the trees can rest during the winter. After my journey and after the ritual, sometimes will return home, sometimes do this in the mountains, but I'll eat a hearty meal and have a warm drink and offer her some. And then when I get home, I make a fir decoction by boiling some of the fir needles, and I use that in my bath. At the end of the wintry season, I see the snow melting, and that indicates to me that it's time to return to Njord. So when the last snow melts away, I'll go to the mountains and ritually thank Skadi for holding the snow and for letting it go so that it flows to the ocean slowly. There's lots of other ways that we can work with Skadi. She likes to have milk or red wine is her signal of invitation. You can drink harsh herbal teas, black teas, vodkas, winter ale. Just spending some time by yourself in nature or going hunting or hiking. And that hunting doesn't necessarily have to be literal. It could be foraging, hunting for plants like I like to do. We can use animal parts and bones, like antlers and bones and things like that. I use that when I'm making the Viking ladders. She also is represented by the rune Isa, which is Birch has taught us is the block, right? It's the ice in the block. But we can also use some other runes in our workings with her as well. We could donate time or money to conserve natural areas, and especially to the protection of wolves. We can light candles or burn incense that would be appealing to her. We can give her offerings of berries and foraged foods. We can work on meditating to clear our minds and use the crystals that are associated with that clear-mindedness as well. Really, what she wants us to do is to practice our independence and our self-reliance and to become comfortable in our solitude and in our own personal practices. We can also, to honor her, use our sense of righteousness and vengeance to work towards justice. One of the things that I found in working with her and through talking to other people that work with her in their unverified personal stories is that she really responds well to the signals in the areas wherever you happen to be. So perhaps your signal is that the first iguana warning of the season, or when the pumpkins begin appearing in stores. I think she would really welcome the same kinds of rituals, but adapted in a way that is appropriate for where you happen to live. So maybe instead of the blood ritual in the snow like I do, you could do that on crushed or shaved ice, or you can do that on sand at the beach. And I think that that's really important thing for us to think about too, is that even though she lives in the mountains and in the snow, even very, very far away from that, that snow is still really important. That's the snowpack is our drinking water for most of Southeast Asia, for example, for those that are downstream in the Mississippi River deltas. As the river is flowing, it's really Scotty that is connected to that. So maybe also instead of harvesting from the wild, we can use Christmas trees or garlands. We can also use a bowl of ice cubes to hold a candle to perform rituals at home, or maybe take a polar plunge in your shower or your bathtub. I also think that she really enjoys winter sports, and especially winter sports that are played outside. So even something as simple as like watching the Winter Olympics or going to a hockey game maybe is a way of connecting with her and opening that door. She also likes things that are mint flavored, so I kind of have a suspicion that she would really like a mojito. So the next deity that we're going to talk about is the Kaliak, and the Kaliak has many, many names and nicknames and stories that vary locally in the places where she comes from. She's oftentimes referred to as Ann Kaliak, Kaliak Bure, Kaliak Biera, and Biera. The Bure word means sharp in the original Celtic languages. The Kaliak is sharp and biting wind. She is the bearer of storms and snow and frost. Most of the time, we see her as a crone mother goddess, and she moves between this world and the next. Her image is probably the archetype of the weathered woman that we see in like Halloween media, maybe the prototype of what witches look like in our imaginations. Her stories consistently seem to have four really big main ideas. She's the bringer of the winter, she's the weather witch, she's the goddess of destruction, and she's the goddess of creation. It's said that in the dark hours of Samhain, the Kaliak washes her great plaid in a whirlpool that's located just north of the Isle of Jura in the British Isles. And when her plaid emerges from the water, it's clean and it's shining white, and she uses that to cover Scotland in a blanket of snow. Throughout the winter, she walks the land and she strikes the ground and the trees with her staff to crush away any signs of growth that might be appearing. People also say that she drags her staff, and that's how the rivers have been carved out, and that she drops stones as she walks that make the landscape. The Kaliak appears at Samhain and gives way to Bridget at Imbolc at this time. Although she does tend to linger a little bit, so she's still kind of around between Imbolc and either Ostara or Beltane, wherever the real true sense of spring is where you happen to live. In some of her stories, that giving way to Bridget is a chase and a fight, and some other stories, she simply turns over stones and returns to an underworld. So the Kaliak can be understood as having two forms, a dark form and a bright form. and Bridget might be her in a bright form. At Imbolc, she drinks from the eternal well and starts to become youthful for summer and as the ages continue. And then in autumn, she appears as a corn doll that's made from the wheat harvests. One story says that at Imbolc, the Cailleach gathers her firewood for the rest of winter, and if she wishes the winter to last longer, she'll make sure that the weather is bright and sunny on Imbolc so that she can gather plenty of firewood. But if the weather on Imbolc is foul, that means that she is asleep and winter is almost over. In the UK, Cailleach's activity is seen by how the hedgehogs behaved on Imbolc, and that tradition later gave way to become Groundhog's Day in the US. I'm looking at the chat, and the Queen of Winter, the Norse goddess, tames the devil. Hey, absolutely, one can't be brave without fear. I like Phoenix says that Scotty is the pagan Elsa. I love it. That's beautiful. Yeah. So yeah, the Cailleach is totally appropriate for us to be talking about today for Imbolc, and then today's being the Groundhog's Day. So at the height of winter in Scotland, it was customary for the head of household to carve the Cailleach's image on a piece of oak at the height of winter. And that log represented cold and death, and it would be burned to ash in the fire. And that ensured that the cold winter would give way to spring. So people would associate different types of winds with her moods and how she was feeling. Cold winds, cutting winds, right? The winds that come off of the mountains. She's also associated with black ash or with the burnt part of the oat bannock as well. While the Cailleach is associated with death and destruction, her true power really lies in transformation. She's also known for guardianship and for deep wisdom. Without her winter culling, without killing all of the life in winter, life wouldn't really be possible in the spring. It's her wrath that makes the new life strong. If we think about the plants that can withstand winter, they have to be really strong and sturdy to be able to do that. And so her wrath makes this life strong and able to endure the hardships that are going to come. She's the keeper and guardian of the essential life force. She's also associated with wolves, boar, and deer, and we do see especially wolves and deer being associated with a lot of the winter deities. She guides hunters to be stewards so that they hunt responsibly so that the population remains balanced and strong. And one story says that a priest tried to count the bones in her house, but died of old age because he couldn't count that high. The image on the screen at Glen Lyon is thought to be Cailleach's house. And so every year at Imbolc, they come here and turn the stones over and place bones in the opening in honor of the Cailleach. So even though we don't experience the chill of snowy winters like in Scotland, there are many ways that the Cailleach appears in our warmer climates. She places the rivers where they are and has placed the stones where they are. She's the wind, she's the crashing coast and the torrential rain. So when wherever there's waterfalls, people say that the water is flowing over her napping body. She's the cycle of the year, and perhaps also the most ancient mother of tribes. She's another one that is thought to have very early origins that preceded really people living in Europe. As people migrated into Europe, that she probably existed in that time. So there's a number of ways that we can honor her, and especially honor her in our warmer places. We can collect and carve and burn oak wood. We can work with the water-worn stones, which I've given a presentation about in the past. We can welcome her at Samhain and bid her farewell at Imbolc. One of the ways that we might do this is to paint a stone with her image on one side and with Bridget on another, and turn the stone over on our altar. Keep the stone on the altar and just keep flipping it every year as the cycle changes. Almost like you would for the changing between the oak and the holly king, but a slightly different kind of a cycle. She's also associated with the color blue, so we can light blue candles or use blues in our seasonal altars. She's a protector in extreme conditions, and we can appeal to her for protection in whatever storms occur where you live, such as hurricanes or tornadoes or monsoons. She's associated with the land and the sea, so we can use seawater in our moon water rituals or place rocks on our altars, and you get extra credit if they happen to be the water-worn kinds of rocks. Because of the story of the priest counting the bones, we can use bones in our protection magic or in our divination work, like casting of the bones. And then she also likes gifts and crafts that are made with the wheat shafts, especially at Mabon and Lunasa. I'm going to pause for just a second and check the chat. Yep, we're getting the early spring this year. I saw that Puxatawny Phil said so. Hey. And the El Nino has been keeping the winter at bay for sure. Yeah, it's been a very strange winter. Catastrophic cold in some places and slightly warmer temperatures in others. Earthquakes, yeah, the movement of Cailleach across the landscape is one of the things that might cause earthquakes. We actually just had one here not too long ago. It was very, very close to my house. It wasn't a very big one at all, but it was close enough that I felt it. And I definitely grabbed something and said, okay, Cailleach, I hear you. We're good. So Birch, this one is for you specifically. Frau Berchta is a Germanic deity, and she goes by many names and has a lot of other associations as well. She can be associated with as a similar kind of a deity as deities we find in other systems like Diana and Hecate and La Befana. The name Berchta is very closely tied to the birch tree and the rune Berkano. And she lives in the mountains under the evergreens, and the holly tree happens to be sacred to her. One of the ways that we can use holly or use where we live to adapt our practices is that we don't have holly here in California, but we have another plant that's called Christmas tree. And we call it Christmas tree because the first Europeans that came here used it as a replacement for holly. So Frau Berchta is associated with mayflowers, with flax and wild berries, and with goats, crickets, owls, and fox. She is also associated with spinning and the textile arts. So I work with her when I do my tablet weaving, which is a very ancient type of weaving with cards. She's the protector of children and women and leads those that she cares for gently into the next life. And so in that way, she's associated with the circle of birth, life, and death. And you may have seen that theme in all three of the deities that we've talked about today. And she wears 3 keys that symbolize these phases. And the key is also associated with Hecate, so you can make those connections there as well. She was originally depicted as a woman with long black braids and a white dress, but later on in history, she becomes more often depicted as an older, disheveled woman. And so that might be evidence that she's a triple goddess in a living manifestation. She is often also shown as having the feet of a goose, and is associated with shape-shifting abilities and might be the origin of Mother Goose. Shape-shifting in European witchcraft especially, is usually associated with really high magic and with transformations. And it's also really closely associated with animals and spirits that live in different realms than humans. So, for example, animals that live in the water or animals that live in the air are usually connected with shape shifting. And so Frau Berchta is considered a goddess of the in-between places and times, and she's also depicted as a bit of that contradiction, like Skadi is, where she's both maidenly and crone kind of simultaneously. Berchta is one of the deities and maybe the leader of the procession that collects the souls of the dead during the night of the wild hunts. And one of the more interesting attributes of Berchta is that she's the keeper of the rules of society and frowns on taboos, which I find to be incredibly Germanic. So some ways that we can work with Frau Berchta is to set up an altar with candles and incense and offerings. She likes gruel and oats, fish, beer, fresh flowers, and candlelight. In her native Germanic home, the flowers maybe would be Edelweiss, but they can be any flowers that are native to where you happen to live. We can appease her by keeping a clean house and being industrious, and she likes it when we sing while we're cleaning. We can decorate with either birch bark or birch twigs, and we can use flax and linen or woven materials in our altar cloths or in our crafts, in our practices. There's an old tradition that your loom had to be set up by January 6th, and that really was closely tied to the Yule traditions, that the period of time from Yule to Epiphany were times to rest and that you shouldn't do any work. And so if you were going to have your loom set up by January 6th, that meant your spinning had to be done by Yule. So we can use this idea kind of as metaphor, or maybe perhaps literally, to have our ducks in a row by New Year's. Right? The idea is to be ready for the new year by having our chores done from the year before. Set a New Year's resolution. We can meditate and act to clear our mind and workspaces, especially again right before Yule, before it's time to rest. And dedicate to her the time between Yule and Epiphany to slow down during that time. We can also partake in a Sabbath order, which is a time when you feast and you don't work. Amethyst says, yep. I like that. The image on the left looks like birch. Yep. That's one of my favorite Berchta pictures. So I want to pause here and open it up for discussion before we move on to how we can adapt some of our rituals where we happen to live, and ask if anybody works with any of these deities or with other deities that are associated with cold or with winter.
Hey, Birch here. Yeah, I work a lot with both Skadi and obviously with Frau Berchta. I actually have my Frau Berchta statue all wrapped up for tomorrow, or I would bring it out to show you guys. But I have the statue I have of her is her shaking out her bag of feathers for the winter. And last time I was up in Minnesota over the winter months, I actually snowshoed out across the lake to a red oak that, still has its leaves on it, even in December. And that's where I did my little bloat to Skadi. And I think she thought it was kind of amusing that I was up there and it was like, 2 above 0 after being in Florida. She seemed to find that really funny. So yeah, she definitely has a sense of humor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have definitely experienced her sense of humor when we've been snowshoeing here and there's like a half an inch of snow. You're not supposed to snowshoe in half an inch of snow.
Yeah,
seems like it would be hard to.
snowshoe, it's like snow up to my waist, trying to crawl through it. I'm very grateful for the snowshoes because I'm only up to my knees.
Amethyst,
Yes.
what were you saying?
It must be very hard to snowshoe in a half an inch of snow.
Desperate times call for desperate measures. Sometimes we get very winter hungry here. So we'll head out, we'll have our snowshoes with us, and sometimes you just don't want to take the time to, put them on and off.
And
when
it's
you're going
easier
across
to
the
wear
ice.
them than to carry them sometimes.
Very much so, yeah. Anybody else?
I think I was once told that Isa, is that right?
Mhm.
Is very much my sign or my rune. I don't I don't know why. I mean, I don't think I'm a cold person, but I was told that because she strong and stable and
It's,
also blocked and
well,
stagnant.
it's not really stagnancy so much as it's dedicated to Verhandi and the present moment. It's about the now. Not worrying about the past, not worrying about the future, but
Yeah.
living in
Yeah.
the moment type thing.
Do
Well,
what's right in front of you.
I tend to live in the moment.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe that's what they meant.
Mhm.
Yeah. But at any rate, I'm not I moved to Florida because if I never see snow again, it'll be too soon. However, especially since I'm doing the Imbolc ritual, my research that I've grown to love the Kaliak. I've just grown to love her. And Bridget bested her with the help of a winter god, but she did not defeat her. She just bested her.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I just grew to love the Kaliak.
Well, she is the crone's crone.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah,
And I certainly am a crone.
yes, for sure.
As I was preparing, I was thinking about Atsana as well, with the Association of Wolves kept coming up.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Wolfies. Well, one thing I always thought about with Skadi and Njord, the association of winter and the sea and how it was a very tempestuous marriage. The sea in the north, the North Sea and the North Atlantic, I mean, it was impassable even for
Mhm.
Vikings for the entire winter because the waves and the violence and the storms were so intense that even they couldn't sail through them.
Mhm.
And I always thought it was very appropriate that when you mix winter and the ocean, that you get that kind of relationship.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because it reminds me of Duluth and Lake Superior, and when you get those, 40, 50 foot high winds in November, waves in November, and 100-mile-an-hour hurricane force winds. And even today, recent times, they can still sink ships like the Edmund Fitzgerald.
That's awesome.
Amethyst, I was just thinking about your connection with Isa, with the rune Isa. One thing I didn't mention about Scotty is that one of the things she teaches us is not to take ourselves too damn seriously too. And so while she can be cold and plotting and thoughtful, right? And she doesn't overreact. She's also very much like what Birch said about being in the moment and to enjoy a good laugh, for sure.
Oh, I laugh a lot and mostly at myself.
Mhm,
Which I think, she appreciates.
mhm,
Because it is
absolutely.
pretty funny when you are happy about it being 2 above because it's been below 0 for 3 days straight and your poor little Floridian now with thin blood.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. All right, so let's carry on. So how can we best celebrate these deities in our warmer climates? Well, I'm going to propose really 3 basic strategies. We can adopt, adapt, or uphold. Right? We can either adopt local practices, we can adapt our traditions to our current conditions, or we can uphold the old and just steadfastly proceed with the older traditions. One example of adapting traditions to conditions is, like I mentioned, the Christmas berry tree being a replacement for holly, or maybe instead of your signal that it's wintertime being that it's snowing outside, maybe your signal is that there's iguanas falling out of the tree. Or for me, I get a very rapid signal when my orange tree turns orange. Hey, I've been watching them grow for the summer, and then they really go through a growth spurt in the fall. And then when it's winter, I know it's winter because they've turned orange. And so it's time to bring out the canner and start making a lot of orange marmalade. So I like to encourage us to welcome the changing seasons and appreciate winter for whatever it is where we happen to live. Maybe it's the return of the migrating birds. Here in Southern California, it's the tamales, right? We can't really have a winter holiday season without steaming, lovely, gorgeous, delicious tamales, decorating our tables. And we make them in such bulk that, we share and swap tamales all winter long, really. In Florida, especially the Florida edition, right, is that in Florida from mid-December to about mid-April, you have fewer mosquitoes. You've got the best wildlife viewing opportunities in the Everglades in January and February. You've got the breeding season. It's 60s and 70s and the lower temperatures at night. So in Florida, probably for a lot of you, just like me here in California, it's now finally cool enough to actually go out and do things, right? And so rather than being a restful time for us, we are getting our rest in a different way. We're getting our rest outside doing reinvigorating kinds of things. You've got beautiful sunsets in the winter, lower prices. You've also got the influx of snowbirds visiting from Michigan and Wisconsin and Canada. And we've got the migratory birds. Here we get the Canadian geese kind of fly over right around this time of year. I'm sure that there's a migratory bird that you're used to watching around this time of year. It's time to take care of our iguana friends. And best of all, in Florida in wintertime, there's no hurricanes. So really, I want to encourage you to embrace the darkness. The winter time and the cold time, whatever it is where you live, is a time for us to do dark and baneful magic, which I've talked about this a couple of times, that baneful magic and dark magic doesn't mean bad. It's not evil. It's things that are reversing or the opposite of. There are things that go widdershins. So for example, it might be time to try to get rid of greed, right? You're trying to undo greed. None of us would say that that was a bad thing. It's also time to embrace our crone and sage wisdom and to get quiet and to celebrate that wisdom or to seek it out. It's a time for restfulness. And again, restfulness for me oftentimes means going outside and being in nature more often because it's finally cool enough to. But that restfulness might be having more inside time or not working as hard, depending on wherever you happen to be. that dark time is really time for us to weather the storm and to appreciate the rot and decay that happens in nature that is really going to give us the life, right, and the vibrancy that comes. I think of this in a metaphor. This is about the time of year that we start putting a lot of stuff into our compost bins. And so the compost bin acts a little bit like that underworld. We're putting the dead in there to rot so that we can fertilize our magical gardens as they're coming later. The iguanas go swimming in the ocean too, yeah. And the snowbirds. I'm not sure if you meant iguanas or snowbirds, but I guess both would be true technically. And we can make a point to travel. Maybe we could travel to colder locations. So for me in California, it's only about an hour or two drive for me to get to a snowy elevation. For those of you in Florida, it probably would take a little bit longer to drive to the Carolinas, perhaps before you would find anything that you could even remotely call cold. But our travels to cold don't necessarily have to be literal. We can travel vicariously to my own local San Bernardino Mountains by watching the Eagle Nest cam. Just this week, our local celebrities laid their third egg of the season, and they've never done that before, and it's actually really rare. And they've got quite a following, and they've been on the national news a couple of times as well. So there's a huge community of people that love to sit and watch the live Eagle Nest cam. We can also practice the Icelandic tradition of cozying up with a good book, right? Find a story that takes you to a wintry place. And we can visit our winterlands through astral projection or shamanic journeying as well. So I personally like to encourage people to adapt their craft to their local area and to the local conditions where you happen to be at. And so this is definitely coming from a Northern Hemisphere perspective. For our friends in the Southern Hemisphere, there would be some mild changes that we would have to make to this. But we can think about the cardinal directions, the elements in the cycle of the year being somewhat overlapping and aligned and moving in a deisal or clockwise fashion along this circle or this cycle. So to the north is Earth, and that's aligned with the winter solstice or Yule. To the east is air and spring equinox. To the south is fire and summer solstice. And to the west is water and autumn equinox. And those that practice astrology would also align these directions and times of year with certain ruling planets. I will definitely defer to Anne for more information about the astrology side of it. We also then overlay this with various associations with plants, with crystals that represent these kinds of associations. So in astrological time, in our calendars, if you were to look at your calendar that you have hanging on your wall, it would say that winter solstice is the beginning of winter and that winter ends at the spring solstice. And it looks something like this, where the solstices and the equinoxes are the beginnings of seasons. In the Celtic tradition, it looks more like this, where the solstices and the equinoxes are the mid-season. So winter goes from Samhain to Imbolc in the Celtic tradition, where it goes from solstice to spring equinox to Ostara in the astrological traditions. So that's one of the first things that we should think about is which kind of a system are you on, or what does winter actually look like where you happen to live? But the key idea here that I wanted to think about is that magic uses alignment, balance, and opposition. And so, for example, winter is dark, but winter wants light. And so we'll find a lot of associations with winter things in winter that we're going to celebrate. But then also on the other opposite side of the cycle, we're looking forward to summer. We want light, we want warmth. We also have a closer association with the things that are in the in-betweens. So, for example, in winter, our storms, our water and air systems that are combining. In winter, they're going to be cold winter storms, snowstorms, sleet. In the summertime, they're going to be more like hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that. So just slightly different manifestations of those middle, whatever happens to be in the middle on the cycle. So it's all about intent, right? We've probably all heard that that saying, and really kind of many of our tools are corresponded to parts of the cycle. So if you were working with herbs, you might associate pine with winter, earth, and north. You might associate lavender with the spring air and east. You might associate copal with fire, summer, and south, and apple with water, autumn, and east. And there's these really big sets of associations. So the phrase that it's all about intent, I think that sometimes it gets tossed around, and it sometimes implies that our tools don't really matter so much as it's all about our thoughts and what we want to have happen. But what I would argue is that it's what it really means is that we can replace aspects of our magic with other items that represent the same things, that our recipes are somewhat flexible. For example, you can make the same basic cookie recipe and replace the chocolate chips with butterscotch chips, and you're still going to have a cookie of some kind. So I don't think that we can just do this willy-nilly, but it has to be something that has that same intent or has that same kind of association. So I would like us to think about how can we use this information to adapt our craft, to use our tools interchangeably. Things like herbs or crystals or color magic, with things that are more locally available or locally appropriate in our craft. So for a green or hearth witch, the apothecary of tools for winter might include things like the icy hot herbs and oils, things like menthol, camphor, peppermint, spearmint, wintergreen. It might include the cooling herbs that are, so the ice hot kind of have both properties. The cool herbs are going to be representations of winter, things that are aloe vera, lavender, chamomile, lemon balm. We might also use winter plants, snowdrop and hellebores and witch hazel, crocus. Those are all flowers that bloom in winter. Or it might be plants that we associate with winter, like holly, fir, cedar, juniper. In our gardens, it's like arugula and cruciferous vegetables are the good winter hardy vegetables. Winter is also time for us to sow seeds. And so there's some seeds that actually want to be sown before the frost, the coriander, parsley, thyme, chives, fennel, some bulbs. Depending on where you live, maybe it's time to sow those seeds. Maybe it's time just to use seeds in your craft or as offerings on your altars. And then, of course, the winter also is associated with preserved and fermented food and drink. And that, of course, makes sense for our cold climate ancestors because they didn't have access to fresh fruit and vegetables year round like we do, right? We move our vegetables all over the world, and especially those of us in our warmer climates, we still grow vegetables in our winter seasons. And so we maybe don't rely on preserved and fermented foods as much, but maybe it is time to pull out the mead, right? And have some celebrations, have preserved foods represented in our cake and ales, in our rituals. We also know that many of our modern holiday aesthetics and traditions are borrowed from our crafty witches of old. That period of time around Yule and Imbolc especially are the perfect time to celebrate the cold deities and to embrace our crafty witch. Even from afar, where snow isn't present, we know that snow is a part of us. and sustains our drinking water. So maybe we'll use the snowy sigil, the form of a snowflake, something like that in its mystical form, in trinkets and charms and amulets. We can use snowflake charms in our witches' bells or to decorate our besoms, and any kind of sigil-oriented type of craft as well. Maybe wood burning, carving it on your candles, that kind of thing. We could also use the image of the snowflake in like the old paper cutouts of snowflakes, right? And use those in our workings in our altars. Did you know that the first snowmen were built as guardians and protectors of the home? So I say crochet yourself a Frosty, right? A Frosty the Snowman. For those of us in Florida and Texas and California, it's citrus season. So I spend several days around this time of year making many, many batches of orange marmalade. This is also a really great time of year to harvest twigs and branches and fronds for crafts like the Bridget's cross that we use at Imbolc, or even the Yule Bak that we use at Yule, the Yule goat. Here in California, our Mediterranean climate is a little bit backwards. So our winter is the end of our drought and dormancy period. So our winter is when the grasses come back just enough that they're pliable. So they make really good craft supplies, right about this time of year. In parts of Florida, it's ryegrass and cabbage palm season, and those are also really good fiber plants for crafting with. So I would encourage us in our crafting experiences to think about color magic and making crafts with bones and with rushes and grasses, and really to embrace the Danish saying hygge, right? The hygge is finding your cozy, right? Making it comfortable for you. Yeah, I like that. The Elsa and the snowmen that protect the castle. Yep, absolutely. We can also practice this in the way that we arrange our altars and our offerings. Now, looking at these images, you're probably looking at the middle image on the bottom stands out is looking a bit summery and out of place, right? It doesn't really seem to go with the other images quite as much, but this is a tropical winter altar. This is what a winter harvest looks like in a tropical climate. Winter altars are oftentimes going to be adorned with elements that are aligned with the earth in winter, and its various associations like darkness and death in the underworld, rest and cold. Here we can see some of the winter altars have antler and bone and evergreens, for example. But these altars all also have plenty of those attributes in the opposition. The representations of fire and summer, sun and light and warmth. It's one of the reasons why we associate oranges happen to be one of the signs of the sun. That for us in our warmer climates, they're just now coming ripe, but in a colder climate, an orange really represented something sunny and delightful, especially. So oranges take on a really important representation of the sun. Same thing with the warming spices that only grow in much warmer climates, but they become very important in the colder, especially European climates, as a warming tool, right? And as a tool to preserve meats and things like that in the colder climates. If you're lucky enough to get snow, snow water has purifying and energizing qualities. It's really great to use it in moon water, in crystal elixirs, in purification rites, and we can use it to bless and cleanse our altar tools as well. But if you can't access snow water, you can make your own. Think of like a granita or a margarita or even a slushie. Granitas are really easy to make. You just make a simple syrup by mixing water and sugar over heat until they're combined. And then you pour that simple syrup on like a baking sheet, And then about every half an hour to an hour or so, once it starts to solidify, you take a spatula and just shake it up a little bit, scruff it up until it's fluffy and icy, kind of like a slushy from a 7-Eleven, kind of a texture. So make your own snow. We can even practice cold magic in the bathroom. If there's something that you want to go away, you can perform a really simple fog banishing by writing a sigil that represents the thing that you're worried about on the window or mirror. And when the fog goes away, it takes your worry with you. Ice is really easy to work with in cold magic, and with modern technologies, we don't have to be anywhere near ice to natural ice to make ice. Right? We can use ice from our refrigerators and our freezers. And so we can use these kinds of qualities in alternatives by doing freezer spells. In talking about Scotty, we talked about putting a candle in a bowl of ice. You can put your worries in a bowl of melting ice, and when it melts, your worries melt with it. We can do snowflake crafts, right? Lots of different ways that we can incorporate ice and snow into our magic, even when we're far away from these natural kinds of elements. And the cold deities are oftentimes associated with that steely ice resolve and with the protection qualities. They're warriors, they're fierce, they're guarded, right? They are reasoned, they value justice and vengeance, but also joy. Winter knows how to take out its wrath when it has to, right? Winter can be that time of the year that is just horrible at times. And so we might sometimes have to protect ourselves from the winter as well. But it might be that the colder times, the protections associated with these colder times, because the colder times actually do help protect us, right? They help protect us from a lot of warm climate diseases, for example. And it's also when traditionally the warriors would be home, and so they would be home to do the protection work. They would be sharpening their tools, sharpening their defenses, getting ready for how to defend the home front when they were gone. And so we can use a lot of our cold associations in protection. The Isa rune works really great as a blockade, as a way to steel yourself and protect yourself. I draw an Isa rune in dragon's blood on my skin every day as I leave the house, for example. We can use the some of the winter herbs are associated with winter and protection. Cinnamon, probably a lot of us do the first of the month blow cinnamon into your house for protection kinds of rituals. Holly and mistletoe and pine are all associated with protection. Rosemary and thistle are as well. One of the things that we can do with some of these herbs is to make wreaths, and wreaths are actually protective wards. And so we could, for example, use our own local supplies, greenery, our own evergreens, whatever's green in your wintertime, to make those protective wreaths. For us here in California, as we're taking the oranges off the tree, that's also the time that we prune the tree. And so we can use the orange leaves to make a protective wreath. In the South, when I lived in the South, we used to use magnolia quite a lot to make our winter wreaths as protections. Winter medicinal herbs are oftentimes roots or otherwise earthy, have a lot of earthy qualities to them, and that earthy quality is representative of protection as well. So things like eating your carrots, right, can be a form of protection magic as well. And then the sound of bells is actually a winter sound, and that sound helps to ward off evil spirits as well. So maybe make your witches' bells in the winter times, or use things like the snowflakes or the Isa runes in your witches' bells crafts. So whatever the cold time looks where you live, it might be a dark time or just a a time that has a bit less light, I ask you to embrace it and to learn from nature. One of the things that we know about winter traditionally is that a lot of animals migrate to warmer climates in winter and cooler climates in summer, but that's not always necessarily true, right? We can embrace where we live too. Bald eagles, for example, lay their eggs in the colder conditions because it's easier to keep them warm in the cold than cold in the warm. And it gives them the best chance of life when it comes time for them to fledge in the springtime. Ladybugs, they don't really migrate, but they do locally move to colder places. Here in California, they move to the canyons and a little bit upslope in winter so that they reduce their body temperature so that they can hibernate. They essentially put themselves in a freezer. Plants don't have the luxury of moving, so they have to adapt. So maybe what our way of dealing with winter is to adapt to our surroundings. And I really want us to think about how nature uses microclues well in advance of seasonal changes and begins to prepare for the seasons that are coming. And in our warmer climates, sometimes our seasonal, our clues, right, that the seasons are changing are micro clues, right? We don't have huge changes in temperature. We don't have these big warnings of snowstorms and things like that. So we have to be a little bit more subtle, and we have to listen to nature and learn from nature a little bit more. I also want us to really think about how we care for the climate. The climate change it occurs more rapidly and with greater magnitude in colder seasons and in colder locations. So the cold altitudes and the cold latitudes have less opportunity to migrate because they really don't have anywhere to go. And we know that winter is shortening, for example, in the colder climates. It's one of the polar bear issues in the Arctic, for example. And so this puts the realms of our cold deities really at the greatest risk. And so what I want us to learn from nature and what I want us to learn from the way we care for the climate is that we are all connected. And I think that has been shown throughout the idea of the snow gives us the rivers and our drinking water, even though we're very, very far away from it, that we are really all connected and interconnected. And so even if we don't live in a cold climate, we still need the cold and we still really rely on that cold. And it's up to us to be good stewards of the cold as well. So just to wrap up and in summary, a lot of the deities that we work with hail from colder places and realms than where we happen to live today. So we can honor them by adopting our local practices from our indigenous friends. We can honor them by adapting traditions to local conditions, or we can uphold the old traditions and carry them with us. So I'd like to open it up and hear from everyone else how you happen to work with cold deities or cold elements in your practices. I'm going to go ahead and stop the sharing so we can open it up and everybody can have a chance to share.